Every morning, before the sun burned through the fog that clung to Riverside Cemetery like a mourner's breath, Marcus walked the same path he had walked for 3 years. His shoes had worn grooves into the earth. His body knew every stone, every turn, every shadow cast by the old oak trees that had stood watching over the dead for decades, perhaps longer than anyone could remember. The cemetery was older than the town itself, and it carried the weight of all those years in its silence. His son's grave lay in the eastern corner, beneath a marble headstone that bore a date Marcus could not yet bring himself to fully accept. October 17th, 3 years ago, this autumn. Below that date was a single line. Thomas Marcus Reed, 1984 to 2021. He saw beauty in all things. Marcus had written that epitaph in a fog of shock and sedatives, unsure if the words were true or if they were simply what he needed to believe about a boy he had failed to truly know while he was alive. The ritual never changed, and Marcus was grateful for its consistency. Structure was the only thing holding him together now. He would arrive between 4 and 5 in the morning, before the world woke, before the living disturbed the privacy of grief. He would place fresh flowers, always daisies, because those had been Thomas's favorite since childhood, and sit in silence for exactly 1 hour. Sometimes he brought coffee in a thermos. Sometimes he brought nothing but the weight of his own regret. He would speak to the stone, though he never quite understood if anything he said reached the boy beneath the earth. Words felt insufficient, hollow, like prayers spoken into a void by someone who had stopped believing in miracles. Yet Marcus came anyway, because not coming felt like abandonment, and he had already abandoned his son in so many ways while the boy was alive. This was his penance, his private vigil, his only remaining language for love. What Marcus did not know was that someone else had been visiting the grave too. For the past 8 months, every few days, a hand neither Marcus nor anyone else at the cemetery could identify had been leaving small tokens of remembrance. A smooth riverstone with a single word carved carefully into it. Brave. A drawing of a boy laughing, rendered in pencil with such tenderness that it broke the heart of anyone who saw it, left in a weatherproof envelope sealed against the rain. A handwritten note that read simply, "Your father loves you more than his words can say." These messages appeared and disappeared like miracles, like someone had been standing witness to Marcus's private grief and decided with quiet certainty that he should not carry it alone. This is the story of how a stranger's kindness became a bridge between a father's broken heart and the possibility of peace. This is a story about the light that survives within loss, and how sometimes the world sends us exactly what we need when we have stopped believing in mercy. This is a story about 2 people, both carrying unbearable sorrow, who discovered that healing does not come from forgetting, but from being witnessed, from being held in the compassion of another's remembrance. Chapter 1. The Weight of Mornings Extended. Marcus had forgotten what it felt like to sleep through an entire night. His bed had become a place where hours stretched like torture, where silence accumulated like dust in the corners of a room no one enters. At 4 in the morning he would wake without dreaming. He no longer dreamed, and lie in the darkness listening to the house settle around him. His wife had left 14 months ago. She could not bear to live in the same space where their son had died. She could not bear to look at Marcus and see reflected in his face the same failure she saw in her own. Their marriage had ended not with argument, but with mutual dissolution, 2 people sinking beneath the weight of shared grief until they could no longer reach each other. They had divorced quietly, almost politely, and Marcus had remained in the house where Thomas had grown up, where his absence occupied every room like a haunting. The house was too quiet. The silence was not peaceful, but suffocating, the silence of something that had died and was not coming back. So Marcus rose before dawn and dressed in the darkness, moving through rooms his son would never inhabit again, rooms that had become monuments to a life interrupted. He would move through the kitchen where Thomas had once made elaborate breakfasts on Sunday mornings, pancakes shaped like animals, eggs arranged into faces, and out to the garage where his car waited like an escape vessel. The drive to Riverside took 15 minutes. He always parked in the same spot, beneath the iron gate where the morning air carried the scent of wet grass and stone, the particular smell of old earth and marble that had become more familiar to him than his own home. The cemetery was his sanctuary now, the only place where his grief felt appropriate, where silence was not a void, but a language, where the living were not expected to pretend that everything was manageable, or that time was healing, or that they should be moving on. Here, he was not the man his colleagues whispered about. Did you know his son killed himself? Not the father who failed to notice his boy was suffering beneath an unbearable weight. Here, he was simply a man in mourning, and that felt honest. That felt true. Thomas had been 18 when he took his own life. The boy had been struggling for years, anxiety that manifested as perfectionism, depression that hid behind jokes and careful social performance, a sensitivity to the world's cruelty that seemed almost physically painful to witness. But Marcus had been working 70-hour weeks. He had been climbing toward a partnership at his firm. He had been present in body, but absent in all the ways that mattered. When Thomas had called him that evening, a Thursday in October, a night that had been unremarkable in every way that now felt like a grotesque crime, Marcus had been in a meeting. He had texted his son back later, "Talk tomorrow, swamped tonight." By tomorrow, there was no one to talk to. The word suicide remained difficult in Marcus's mouth, so he said left or past, or sometimes just fell silent entirely, allowing the ellipsis to hold what he could not voice. The guilt had calcified into something Marcus carried like a second skeleton, something that had fused with his bones. If he had been home that night, if he had listened to the quiet strain in his son's voice during their last phone call, if he had chosen his son over his career, chosen presence over ambition, chosen to see the boy drowning in plain sight. These thoughts had become grooves worn into his mind, paths he walked compulsively, returning again and again to moments he could not change. The flowers he brought were always daisies, white ones in summer, pale yellow ones in autumn, and the deep pink ones in spring that Thomas had loved as a child, when he was still small enough to pick them from the yard and present them to his mother with dirt still under his fingernails. Marcus would kneel at the grave, press his palm against the cold stone, as though touch could transmit a message across the boundary between worlds, and speak the words he could not voice to anyone else. Some days they were apologies, raw and desperate. "I should have been there. I should have seen. I should have loved you better." Some days they were memories, fragments of a life he had taken for granted. The sound of Thomas laughing at something on television, the careful way he had arranged his photographs. The morning he had asked Marcus if he thought broken people could ever become whole again, a question Marcus had dismissed as teenage melancholy rather than recognized as a cry for help. Some days they were simply the sound of his own breathing, which seemed to be the only way to prove he was still alive, that his heart was still beating. That continuing to exist was not itself a betrayal of the boy who had chosen to leave. But 3 months ago, something had changed. Marcus had arrived one morning to find a smooth stone placed carefully against the headstone, positioned so it would not roll away, but would be visible to anyone visiting the grave. At first, he thought it was the work of other visitors, other families leaving tokens for their own dead, flowers, coins, photographs, the small tributes people leave as proof that their loved ones are remembered. Then he saw the word carved into the stone with deliberate care. Brave. The letters were clean and precise, the work of someone who had taken time with this gesture, who had understood that each mark mattered. Marcus stared at the stone for a long time. He had never considered Thomas brave. He had considered him fragile, sensitive, struggling, lost, a boy whose sensitivity to the world's edges had eventually cut him to pieces. But perhaps bravery and fragility were not opposites. Perhaps they lived in the same person, in the same moment, in the same heart that could not bear the weight of staying, but had survived 18 years of trying. Perhaps there was courage in the very fact of having existed at all, of having loved and created and tried to make sense of a world that was not always gentle. Marcus had pocketed the stone and said nothing to anyone. He told himself it was coincidence, that strangers left such things all the time, that cemeteries were full of anonymous tokens, and he should not read meaning into what was likely random. But his hands trembled as he drove away from the grave that morning, as though something in the world had shifted, as though a door he had thought permanently locked had opened slightly, letting in a thin line of light. Chapter 2. The Messages Begin, Extended. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened and the leaves began their transformation from green to gold to rust, the stones and drawings and notes accumulated at Thomas's grave like a conversation Marcus was having with someone he had never met. The messages were never intrusive or performative. They came in the quiet voice of someone who understood that grief did not need eloquence or grand gestures, only witnessing, the simple act of showing up, of paying attention, of refusing to let someone be forgotten. One note, written on cream-colored paper in careful handwriting, read, "The light through the trees looks like the kind of light he would have photographed." Marcus had forgotten, or perhaps had never truly known, having been absent for so much of his son's inner life, that Thomas kept a camera. But now fragments of memory returned. He had seen the camera around Thomas's neck sometimes. He had noticed his son disappearing for hours into the forest behind their house, absorbed in some project Marcus had never thought to ask about. Only after Thomas died had his wife found the photographs Thomas had taken, hundreds of them carefully organized on his laptop. Trees fractured by light, water surfaces that reflected sky, birds in flight, flowers photographed from below so they looked monumental against the clouds. In each image was Thomas's particular vision, his hunger to capture beauty, his desperate attempt to document a world he was finding increasingly unbearable. Eleanor told Marcus later, when they finally met, that she had learned about these photographs from Thomas himself. During his time in the hospital, after the overdose attempt that had preceded his death by 1 year, Thomas had shown her pictures on his phone. He had explained his process, his theory of light, his belief that if he could just photograph the world correctly, he might be able to understand why it was worth living in. Eleanor had listened to him talk about photography the way a priest listens to confession, with attention, with reverence, with the understanding that this was sacred. Thomas had never told her his last name, or where he lived, or anything that would make him traceable. But he had told her about the forest behind his house, the specific quality of light at dawn, the way certain trees seemed to hold his attention in a way nothing else did. Marcus read this note over and over, tracing the handwriting, trying to glean information from the shape of the letters. The person who had written this knew details about Thomas that only someone close to the family could know. Yet the handwriting was unfamiliar, the message unsigned, the identity of the sender a mystery that pulled at Marcus like a fishing line in deep water. Another drawing arrived 2 weeks later, left beneath the flowers in a weatherproof envelope. It showed a boy beneath a tree, sketched in careful pencil with a level of skill that suggested serious practice. The proportions were gentle, the face peaceful, the entire image rendered with a kind of tenderness that broke Marcus's heart. The boy in the drawing bore a resemblance to Thomas, though it was not a photographic likeness. It was something more profound. It captured something true about Thomas that his actual photographs had never managed, something the camera could not see. An inner peace, a kind of acceptance, a boy who had finally found rest. It looked nothing like the photographs Marcus kept of his son, the school photos with forced smiles, the family pictures where Thomas appeared to be performing the role of happy child. This drawing saw Thomas as he might have been if he had been allowed to simply exist without the burden of expectation or the weight of depression. Marcus began arriving earlier at the grave, sometimes as early as 3 in the morning, hoping to catch whoever this mysterious benefactor was. He brought coffee in a thermos and sat on a bench near Thomas's grave, hidden partially behind a nearby monument, watching the paths that wound through the cemetery. He imagined scenarios. Perhaps a friend Thomas had never mentioned. Perhaps a teacher who had recognized his struggle. Perhaps a stranger who had lost someone and understood the particular mathematics of grief. How it multiplied in isolation. How it could consume everything if not witnessed by another human being. Hours passed in these vigils. The sunrise came and went, painting the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold and pale blue. The groundskeeper moved through the rows with his equipment, cutting grass and trimming hedges and maintaining the borders between the dead and the world beyond. Occasionally, other visitors arrived. People placing flowers, people sitting in private grief, people living out their own rituals of remembrance. But whoever left these messages remained invisible, like a guardian angel operating outside the bounds of the visible world, present only in the careful tokens left behind. Marcus considered calling the groundskeeper or the cemetery office, reporting what was happening, asking if they had security footage or any information about an unknown visitor, but shame stopped him. Shame and something else, a kind of fear that if he reported this, if he made it official or tried to force it into the daylight, it would stop. The anonymous kindness would disappear, replaced by awkward introductions and the complicated dance of gratitude. So Marcus said nothing and continued his vigil, both as a mourner paying his respects to his dead son, and now as someone searching for the mysterious keeper of his son's memory, trying to solve the riddle of why a stranger would take time, real time, to leave gifts at the grave of someone he was almost certain it was a she, based on something indefinable in the gesture, the care, the precision, had never met. Chapter 3. The waiting, extended months passed into a season. The trees above Thomas's grave turned gold and then deep orange and then gradually brown, their leaves collecting in small drifts against the headstone like tributes, like the grave was slowly being buried under a quilt of the season's own making. The air grew sharper. The mornings grew colder. Marcus's vigils became more difficult, more desperate. He purchased a small notebook with a leather cover and began leaving his own messages, not knowing if anyone would read them, not entirely sure he was not engaged in some form of madness. He would arrive at dawn, place the notebook on the grave, weighted down with a smooth stone to keep the wind from scattering its pages, and he would write. Some mornings he wrote about his regrets, the specific moments where he had chosen wrongly. I should have said yes when you asked if I wanted to go to the forest with you. I should have put down my phone. I should have really listened when you called. Other mornings he wrote memories. You were 7 years old and caught a butterfly in your hands. You held it so carefully, afraid of hurting it. And when you opened your palms, it flew away and you cried. But you also laughed and you said, "That's okay, Mom. At least for a minute I got to hold something beautiful." On the hardest mornings, he wrote apologies so raw and desperate that they seemed to bleed from the page. "I'm sorry I failed you. I'm sorry I didn't see. I'm sorry I was not the father you needed. I'm sorry I'm still alive, and you are not. I'm sorry for surviving." He left the notebook on the grave, covered with plastic to protect it from the rain, weighted down with a stone, wondering if this was madness or if it was finally, at last, a form of healing. He wondered if he was writing to Thomas or to himself, if the distinction even mattered. He wondered if someone would read these words, or if they would simply accumulate, unread, until rain and time rendered them illegible. Comment where you're watching from. These stories of kindness connect hearts across the world. One morning in late October, as the air had turned sharp and cruel, and the autumn felt like it was personally trying to break his heart, Marcus arrived at the grave to find his notebook had been replaced carefully beneath the flowers. Someone had read his words. Someone had cried over them. He could tell from the small water stains on the pages, the way certain words seemed to have been traced repeatedly by a wet finger. And on the final page, written in trembling handwriting that spoke of hands shaking with emotion, was a single line: "You are not alone in this sorrow. He was loved. He matters. He will always matter." Marcus sat beside the grave for hours that morning, the notebook pressed against his chest, as though he could draw the words into his body through proximity and pressure alone. The weight of being witnessed, of being recognized in his grief by another human being, felt like the first true kindness he had experienced since Thomas left. Not pity, he was exhausted by pity. Not judgment, he carried enough judgment of himself that he did not need it from others. Not the empty condolences of people who meant well but could not begin to understand, who offered platitudes about time and healing and moving on, as though grief were a project to be completed rather than a geography to be inhabited. This was something else entirely. This was someone saying, without any need for recognition or gratitude or reciprocation, without any expectation of thanks, that they too knew what it meant to carry unbearable loss. This was someone choosing deliberately to show up in the darkness with a stranger and hold the weight for a moment so he would not have to carry it alone. That night, Marcus made a decision. He would sit at the grave every morning for a full week and simply wait, not hidden behind monuments but visible, present, ready to meet the person who had become, unknowingly and impossibly, his guide toward living again. He prepared himself for disappointment. He prepared himself for nothing to happen, for the mystery to remain unsolved, for the person to simply disappear now that they had been noticed. But he also prepared himself, in some small corner of his heart that had not yet entirely died, for the possibility of connection, for the chance to thank someone, for the possibility that his son's death might have meaning if it had brought another person close enough to leave these tokens of remembrance. He brought a thermos of coffee and a chair. He brought a blanket against the cold, and he began to wait. Chapter 4. The vigil ends. Extended. The first 3 days passed with no sign. Marcus sat in a folding chair he had brought from home, metal and canvas, the kind of chair people used at camping trips or backyard barbecues, anchored now in a cemetery beside his dead son's grave. He placed fresh flowers each morning, daisies, always daisies, and waited as the sun rose and the world moved through its ordinary rhythms. The cold deepened. His fingers grew numb despite the gloves he wore. He brought a thermos of hot tea, and later a thermos of hot coffee, and eventually both, uncertain which would be more comforting. He wore a sweater beneath his coat and a scarf that had once been Thomas's, wrapped around his neck so close to his skin that he could almost convince himself that his son was holding him. Other visitors came and went. An elderly couple placed flowers on a grave several rows over. A young woman sat crying quietly beside a monument. A middle-aged man stood in absolute stillness, not moving, barely breathing, locked in some private communion with the dead. The groundskeeper nodded at Marcus in recognition and sadness. He had come to recognize this man who arrived before dawn and sat until mid-morning, a fixture in the landscape of grief. The world turned through its ordinary rhythms, while Marcus kept his vigil at the threshold between grief and grace, between isolation and connection, between despair and the fragile possibility of hope. On the fourth day, as the sun broke through the clouds in that particular way that made the cemetery feel less like a place of death and more like a cathedral made of light, Marcus saw her, a woman in her 60s, perhaps a bit older, with grey hair pulled back in a careful braid, and hands that moved with the deliberate intention of someone who had learned, through years or through experience, to hold fragile things with reverence. She wore a simple coat and carried a small bundle of flowers, white chrysanthemums that seemed to glow in the morning light, and an envelope. She was walking slowly through the cemetery, her path winding past several graves, before arriving at a marker 2 rows over from Thomas's. Marcus watched, thinking perhaps she was simply another mourner, another person keeping their own dawn vigil. But then she paused. Her footsteps faltered. She had seen him sitting there, had noticed the chair and the blanket and the man who had been waiting. And her face transformed with an emotion Marcus could not quite name. It was fear, perhaps. It was recognition. It was the terrible vulnerability of being caught in the act of secret kindness, of having one's private mercy exposed to the light. She stood frozen for a moment, and Marcus could see her deliberating. Should she turn back? Should she pretend she had not seen him? Should she continue with her plan, or retreat into the safety of anonymity? Marcus stood slowly, moving carefully so as not to startle her, giving her room to retreat if she needed to. His movement said, "I mean no harm. I am not angry. You can leave if you wish." For a long moment neither of them moved. The morning held its breath. Then the woman looked down at the flowers in her hands, then back at Marcus, and tears began to stream down her face without sound, tears that fell as though a dam inside her had finally broken. "I didn't know if I should have," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, almost inaudible in the quiet of the cemetery. "I didn't know if it was wrong. I didn't know if I was trespassing on your grief, but I couldn't stop myself from coming." Marcus found that he was crying too, though he could not remember the last time tears had come so easily, so completely, with such absolute abandon. "Tell me," he said, his voice rough and unsteady from disuse. "Please tell me everything." Chapter 5. The Truth Emerges. Extended. The woman's name was Eleanor, and she had known Thomas at the hospital where she worked as a pediatric counselor, a position that had broken her heart in pieces that never quite healed completely. She had met Thomas when he came in on a dark night 3.5 years earlier, brought by paramedics after an overdose attempt that his parents had not even known he was considering. Eleanor had sat with him through the long hours of recovery, through the stomach pumping and the medical procedures and the psychiatric evaluation. She had listened to the fragments of pain he could articulate, the way he described the world as too loud, too bright, too demanding, the way he felt broken and beyond repair. He was in the adolescent wing. Eleanor explained as they sat together on a wooden bench near Thomas's grave, the flowers still held in her trembling hands. "I saw him for 4 days before his parents took him home. He was supposed to follow up with an outpatient therapist, but I never knew if he did. I left the hospital about 2 years ago, burnout, too many kids I couldn't save. Too many nights lying awake wondering what I had missed, what sign I had failed to recognize, what words might have made a difference if only I had said them differently. I moved to a small house near the cemetery, honestly to be close to the dead. I couldn't bear to be surrounded by the living anymore, by people who expected me to fix things I couldn't fix, to save children I had no power to save." She paused, collecting herself, gathering the threads of a story that was still difficult to tell. "I came to the cemetery to grieve, to walk, to remember the ones I had lost, not just Thomas, but all the children I had seen over the years, all the ones who had gotten through that first crisis only to try again, the ones who had succeeded in what they were attempting, I was here trying to make peace with my failure. Eleanor turned to look directly at Marcus, and her eyes held a depth of sadness that only another person who had lost a child could truly recognize. I didn't know Thomas had died until I saw his name on a gravestone. I had no way of knowing. He never told me his last name, and I never knew where he was from. When I saw the dates, when I realized how recently he had died, when I understood that this was the same Thomas I had worked with at the hospital, I thought perhaps I was mistaken. But I knew. Somehow I knew absolutely, the way you know things that break you. Eleanor's voice dropped even lower. For a long time I just came here and sat nearby. I didn't leave anything, didn't disturb the grave or your visits. I was just here for my own grief, for my own understanding of what I had failed to prevent. But gradually, something changed. I started thinking about all the children I had failed over the years, and I realized that one of my failures was right here, in this cemetery, in this grave. And I decided that I couldn't let him be forgotten. I couldn't let him be alone in death, the way I feared he had been alone in life. Marcus listened to this story as though it were being told in a dream, as though Eleanor's words were arriving from some other dimension where the past could be rewritten and meaning could be salvaged from the wreckage of a young life ended too soon. He looked at his son's grave, then back at Eleanor, and something that had been locked inside him for 3 years began to shift, began to crack open, began to allow the possibility that his son's life had mattered beyond his own failure to see it. I started leaving the stones, Eleanor continued. I carved words into them that I wished I had said to him at the hospital. Brave. Because he had survived that night. Because he had tried so hard to continue living afterward, even though it was difficult. I started drawing because drawing is my own way of processing grief, and I wanted to create an image of Thomas as he might have been in a world gentler than this one. I left letters and notes because I needed to speak to him, and the only way I could was through these small acts of remembrance. She looked down at her hands. I thought perhaps his father never visited the grave. I thought perhaps he had abandoned his memory entirely, but then I started noticing the flowers, the fresh daisies placed carefully against the stone, and I knew someone was here, someone was remembering, someone was keeping vigil. I became afraid that my visits were unwelcome, that I was intruding on a grief that belonged only to his family. But I also became certain that I could not stop. I had failed to save him in life. The least I could do was refuse to let him be forgotten in death. Marcus reached out and Eleanor took his hand. In that small gesture, both of them felt recognized. Both of them felt the weight of what they had been carrying alone shift into something that could be shared. "Thank you," Marcus said, and the words felt inadequate but also true. "Thank you for seeing him. Thank you for remembering him when I was too broken to do it alone. Thank you for loving my boy." Eleanor squeezed his hand, and neither of them let go for a long time. Chapter 6. The Bridge Extended. Over the following weeks, as winter began to settle in and the bare branches of the trees seemed to ache in the cold, Marcus and Eleanor fell into a new rhythm at the cemetery. Some mornings, Marcus would arrive at 5 in the morning to find Eleanor already there, arranging flowers, or leaving a fresh drawing, or sitting in quiet contemplation at the grave. Other mornings, he would arrive first and wait, having learned that her schedule varied with the seasons, with her work, with the unpredictable movements of her own grief. They began bringing coffee together, sitting on the wooden bench near Thomas's grave, speaking about the boy they both had known, but in such different ways, from such different distances, in such different contexts. Eleanor told Marcus stories about Thomas during his hospital stay, the ones she had been carrying alone for years, and finally had someone to tell them to who would understand. She told him about the jokes Thomas had made to hide his pain, the way he would deflect serious conversations with humor, how he had made her laugh even on the darkest days of his admission. She told him about the moments when the mask slipped and she caught a glimpse of the frightened teenager beneath the performance, the boy who was terrified of the world, but more terrified of his own mind. She told him about the time Thomas had asked her, one evening as she was preparing to leave the hospital, if she thought broken people could ever become whole again. She had said yes. She had promised him that healing was possible, and then she had left the hospital 3 months later and never saw him again. "I've wondered ever since," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "If I had stayed, if I had continued working, if I had somehow found a way to be stronger, would that have been enough? Could I have prevented this?" Marcus listened to this confession of guilt and took her hand. "I blame myself too," he said, "for not being there, for not listening, for choosing work over my son. But I've learned something, Eleanor. We can't save people who don't want to be saved. We can only love them and hope that's enough, and then carry the grief when it's not." In return, Marcus shared memories of Thomas as a child. Memories that Eleanor did not have because she had only known him in crisis, only known the fractured version of the boy who had broken under the weight of existing. He told her about the time Thomas was 5 years old and had spent 3 days building an elaborate structure from blocks, constructing a world so intricate that when Marcus's wife had accidentally knocked it over, Thomas had cried with a grief so profound that it had seemed to fracture something in him that never quite healed. He told her about the songs Thomas would hum in the shower, old folk songs, Joni Mitchell, blues standards that seemed far too mature for a teenager, music that spoke of loss and longing and beautiful sadness. He told her about the dreams Thomas had mentioned occasionally, almost shyly, of becoming a photographer, of capturing moments of beauty in an ugly world, of finding a way to make sense of existence through the careful selection of light and frame. Eleanor listened to these stories with tears streaming down her face, understanding that these memories were gifts, that Marcus was allowing her to know his son in a way that death had seemed to deny, that he was honoring her love by sharing what he loved about Thomas. "He was an artist," Eleanor said softly. "I didn't fully know that. Not the scope of it anyway, though he told me about his photographs at the hospital. He would light up when he talked about them, and I remember thinking that this light, this passion for something, this might be what saves him. This might be his reason to stay." Marcus felt something crystallize inside him, felt the sharp pain of that realization transform into something else. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but a kind of understanding. "He was an artist," Marcus agreed, his voice steady for perhaps the first time since Thomas's death. "And he still is. His photographs, his vision, the way he saw the world, that doesn't end just because he did. He created beauty that still exists. He matters. He will always matter." One morning in late winter, as the air had turned warmer and small green shoots were beginning to emerge from the dark earth, Eleanor brought a book, wrapped carefully in protective plastic. It was a collection of photography by artists who had struggled with mental illness, published by a non-profit organization dedicated to preserving the work of people who had experienced depression and suicide ideation, but had found ways to channel their pain into art. Eleanor opened it to a specific page, and there, credited in the contributor section, was Thomas's name. He had submitted photographs to this small magazine 3 years before his death, when he was 15 years old, still in high school, still believing that his art might mean something to the world. Neither Marcus nor Eleanor had known about this publication. Neither had known that Thomas's photographs had been professionally printed, curated, displayed for others to see. They sat together, looking at his images on the printed page, A sunrise through fog, the light fractured and soft and almost unreal. A forest stream, the water rendered in shades of silver and blue. A child's hand reaching toward a butterfly, the composition so carefully constructed that it seemed to speak of longing and connection and the fragile nature of beauty. The work was haunting and beautiful, and it spoke of a sensitivity and vision that the world had never properly witnessed, that Marcus had missed while he was working 70-hour weeks, that Eleanor had only glimpsed in fragments during a hospital stay. "He was an artist," Eleanor said again softly, running her fingers carefully over the photographs. "A real artist. I didn't know he had gotten this far with his work." Marcus felt tears return, felt something that had been trapped inside him finally release. "He was," Marcus agreed, "and he still is. His work is still here. His vision is still here. He's still speaking to people through these images." Chapter 7. The Letting Go, Extended. As autumn deepened into winter, and then gradually into spring, Eleanor suggested that they expand their vigil beyond the cemetery's boundaries. She invited Marcus to her home, a small cottage near the woods where Thomas had walked, where he had found the light and the subjects for his photographs. It was a modest place, built in the style of a country home, surrounded by the forest that had been Thomas's sanctuary. And when Marcus stepped inside, he found that Eleanor had transformed it into something sacred. She had filled the walls with copies of the photographs she had found, multiple prints of Thomas's work, professionally framed or simply matted and carefully hung. Alongside these photographs were the drawings Eleanor had been creating, the careful pencil sketches of the boy she had known only briefly but had loved intensely. It was a gallery of remembrance, constructed by a stranger whose love for his son had become its own form of grace. It was a shrine, but not in any religious sense. It was a human shrine, built from genuine connection and the desperate human need to say, "This person mattered, this life meant something, we will not forget." Marcus stood in the center of Eleanor's living room and wept. He had not cried like this since the funeral, the terrible funeral where he had shaken hands with people while feeling like his insides had been hollowed out. He had not allowed himself this kind of complete emotional release since the early days of his grief, when the shock had still been fresh and his body had not yet learned to contain the pain. But here, surrounded by his son's work, witnessing the care with which Eleanor had honored Thomas's memory, Marcus found that he could finally let go of some of the guilt, some of the impossible weight of feeling like he alone should be the keeper of his son's legacy. "I wanted to understand him," Eleanor said, sitting beside Marcus on her worn couch. "After I left the hospital, after I couldn't see him anymore as a patient, I decided that I would understand him through his art, so I looked for his work. I found these photographs published in magazines. I found his images online, where he had posted them, and gradually I began to understand the boy I had met at the hospital. I understood what he was trying to say, what he was trying to create. Together, they began a project that would consume the next several months. Eleanor had been collecting stories from people who had known Thomas, even briefly. They sent letters to his former teachers, his friends from high school, his childhood neighbors, anyone who had any kind of connection to him. A teacher wrote about how Thomas had turned in an essay on environmental destruction that had moved her to tears with its eloquence and its despair and its strange hope. A friend from high school admitted that he had never quite understood Thomas, but he had always admired how committed he was to his photography, how seriously he took his art even when everyone else seemed to think it was just a hobby. A neighbor wrote about seeing Thomas in the garden, photographing flowers from impossible angles, and how she had always wondered what he was seeing through that camera lens that made him focus so intently. Marcus compiled these stories and over the course of several months began writing them down. Not in anger or despair, not in the voice of a man drowning, but with the careful attention of someone honoring a life, someone trying to understand the shape of a brief existence. He was learning to remember not just the end of Thomas's story, but the texture of his entire life, the beginning, the middle, the small moments of connection and beauty that had mattered, even if ultimately they had not been enough to hold him to the earth. "I think I've been so focused on what I failed to do," Marcus told Eleanor one evening, as they sat in her cottage with tea and these collected memories spread across the table like a puzzle they were trying to assemble into meaning, "that I forgot to celebrate what he did manage to create, these photographs. His kindness to the people he encountered, the way he saw the world as something worth documenting, worth preserving, worth sharing with others." Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. "He mattered," she said simply, her voice steady and certain. "That's what I've been trying to tell you in every stone and drawing I left. He mattered, and so do you. Your guilt, your pain, your need to understand. It's all so human, Marcus. It's all so understandable, but maybe it's time to let some of it go. Maybe it's time to replace the guilt with gratitude for having had a son, for having had him for 18 years, even though every single day of those 18 years mattered more than you knew." Chapter 8. The Return Extended. Spring came as it always does, with a kind of quiet insistence that nothing that has died remains dead forever. The trees above Thomas's grave began to show green at the tips of their branches, tender shoots emerging from wood that had been bare and grey through the long winter. New flowers emerged from the dark earth, indifferent to the sorrow of the living and supremely present in their own small resurrections. Crocuses and daffodils and grape hyacinths creating pools of colour throughout the cemetery. Marcus and Eleanor continued their visits, but they came less frequently now, not from forgetting but from a different kind of peace, a kind of healing that allowed them to hold Thomas's memory without being overwhelmed by the weight of grief. One morning in May, when the air smelled like growing things and possibility, Marcus arrived at the grave alone. Eleanor was visiting family out of state, and Marcus had come to leave fresh flowers, not daisies anymore, but a mix of spring flowers that Thomas had loved. A small bouquet that spoke of the season's arrival and the slow turning of time. He had come to sit, as he had done 10,000 times before, in the presence of his son's memory. But today felt different. Today Marcus was not crying. Not because the grief had disappeared, but because it had transformed into something that could coexist with other emotions. Today he was not drowning. Today he was simply present, simply remembering, simply allowing the grief to exist alongside the joy of having had a son at all. The pride of having had a son who saw beauty in the world, who tried to capture it, who created art that still speaks to people years after his death. He placed the flowers against the stone and traced the inscription with his palm, the letters worn smooth by years of touch. Then he did something he had never done before. He spoke aloud, not to the stone, not to the memory of Thomas preserved in marble and earth, but to himself, giving voice to a truth he had been learning over months and years, a truth that had been slowly arriving in his heart. "I loved you," he said, and his voice did not shake. "I love you still. And I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I didn't understand how much you were struggling. I'm sorry I was absent when you needed me to be present. But I'm grateful, Thomas, so grateful that you existed, that you saw beauty in this world, even when the world was difficult, that you tried, that you loved and were loved, even if it wasn't enough to hold you to the earth." The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of new growth and rain-soaked earth, and Marcus could almost believe it was an answer, a kind of forgiveness that did not erase the past, but allowed him to carry it differently, to carry it alongside meaning and pride and gratitude. As he sat there, another visitor arrived, a young woman with a camera, taking photographs of the cemetery in the spring light. She was perhaps in her late 20s, with an artistic eye evident in the way she composed her shots, the way she seemed to be searching for something specific in the landscape of the dead. She passed by Thomas's grave, paused, and seemed to recognize something in the arrangement of flowers and stones, in the care with which the grave had been tended. She smiled sadly, as though seeing a story she could understand, the narrative of a life cut short, but still remembered, still honored, still present in the world through the love of those who survived. She took a photograph of the grave, respectfully, carefully, asking permission with a glance that Marcus answered with a nod. Then she continued on her way, but not before leaving something behind on the grave, a small card with a handwritten message that simply read, "Your beauty matters. Your light survives." Marcus watched her go and thought about how grief and love traveled through the world in invisible currents, how a stranger's kindness could become a lifeline, how the dead were kept alive through memory and attention and the stubborn insistence of those who loved them. And he understood finally that Thomas's death was not the end of his story, but only a transformation of it, that his son would continue to exist through the photographs he had left behind, through the lives he had touched, through the beauty he had documented, through the love of people who had never even met him, but who recognized in his work something true and necessary and worth preserving. Chapter 9. The Light Remains, Extended. A year has passed since that morning when Marcus first saw Eleanor at the grave, since the moment when the mystery of anonymous kindness finally revealed its face. 12 months of seasons turning, of grief transforming, of two broken people learning to hold their shared sorrow in a way that created space for healing. Marcus and Eleanor have become something more than friends. They are not quite family in the traditional sense, but they are bound together by love for someone neither of them could save, bound together by the recognition that sometimes salvation comes not through rescue, but through presence, through witness, through the stubborn refusal to let someone be forgotten. They have learned each other's schedules, each other's griefs, each other's particular ways of mourning. On difficult mornings, when Eleanor feels the weight of all the children she failed to save during her years at the hospital, Marcus sits with her in her cottage and lets her cry without trying to fix what cannot be fixed. On mornings when Marcus feels the guilt returning, when the questions resurface about what he could have done differently, Eleanor reminds him that guilt is not the same as responsibility, that loving someone and failing to save them does not make that love less real. Eleanor has returned to working with youth in crisis, but in a different capacity than before. She counsels parents of children who struggle with mental illness, drawing from the well of her own experiences and losses and the particular knowledge that comes from having lived through the failure to prevent what you most feared. She has started a support group at the cemetery for people grieving the loss of children to suicide, meeting monthly on a Saturday morning in a small pavilion near the main gate. The group has grown to include 15, 20, sometimes 30 people, all of them carrying the specific weight of having lost someone to their own decision to leave. Eleanor facilitates these meetings with a gentleness born from her own sorrow, and people have told her that it is the first place they have found where they did not have to pretend, where they could speak about their dead without the uncomfortable silence or the misguided attempts at comfort. Marcus has begun photography as well, walking the same paths his son once walked, exploring the forest behind the house that had been Thomas's sanctuary. He has discovered that seeing the world through a camera lens is a way of understanding it, of slowing down enough to notice the particular quality of light at certain times of day, the way shadows fall across water, the sudden emergence of beauty in the most ordinary moments. He has not pretended to be an artist in the way Thomas was. His photographs are the work of an amateur, taken by a man learning a new language in the language of his dead son. But they have meaning to him, and they have meaning to others who have seen them. He has published a small book, printed in an edition of only 500 copies, that pairs photographs taken by his son with his own photographs, and with his reflections on fatherhood, on grief, on the particular mathematics of love. The book is titled What Light Remains, Photographs and Reflections on a Life Too Briefly Lived. It is not yet widely known, but it has found its way to some people who needed to read it. Parents searching for meaning in the incomprehensible loss of a child to suicide. Teenagers struggling in the dark and needing to know that others had seen beauty, others had tried to hold on to the world through documentation and art. Others had felt exactly what they felt. The book sits on grief counselors' shelves and in hospital waiting rooms, and in the homes of people who have lost someone to the particular violence of suicidal ideation. The flowers at Thomas's grave are no longer changed only by Marcus. Eleanor brings flowers regularly. So do other members of the grief support group who have come to know the story of the boy who took photographs and the two people who love him still. Other visitors to the cemetery have begun leaving stones and drawings and notes, creating a kind of memorial that has transcended the particular grief of a father and a counselor and become something larger, a testimony to the fact that a life matters, that a death by suicide is a tragedy that resonates beyond the family left behind, that remembrance is a form of healing. The cemetery has become a place not of ending, but of continuing, not of forgetting, but of remembering in a way that honors life rather than merely mourning death. The groundskeeper has noticed the grave, has seen how it is tended with more care than most, and has asked Marcus about his son. Marcus has told him the story, and the groundskeeper has nodded with the understanding of someone who tends the ground where the dead rest, who knows the weight of memory and the importance of small gestures. On difficult mornings, when the grief returns with renewed weight, when Marcus wakes at 4 in the morning and feels the familiar ache of missing his son, he still comes to sit by the grave. But now he sits differently. He sits as a man who has learned that love does not end with death, that kindness can come from the most unlikely sources, that healing is not about forgetting the dead, but about learning to live fully alongside their memory, about choosing to honor what remains. Eleanor joins him when she can. They sit in silence, but it is not an empty silence anymore. It is a silence full of presence, full of a love that has been transformed by time and shaped by grace. They have become, in their own way, the family Thomas would have needed to stay alive, and though they cannot change the past, though they cannot resurrect the dead or undo the decisions that were made, they have discovered that they can honor the memory of the boy who loved photographs and beauty and truth. They can create meaning from the meaningless. They can refuse to let his death be the final word. The light still falls through the trees the way it did when Thomas was alive, the way he captured it in his photographs. The flowers still grow. The seasons still turn with their particular beauty and harshness. And in the cemetery where Thomas's body rests, in the ground that holds his grave, something that looks a great deal like hope continues to bloom with each new season, with each visitor who remembers, with each person who comes to leave a token of respect for a life that mattered, however briefly it was lived. Epilogue. Kindness is not a single act. It is a conversation across time, a message left on marble, a flower placed by a stranger's hand, a photograph that captures light and shadow and beauty. It is the refusal to let someone be forgotten, the determination to see value in a life even when that life has chosen to end. It is a father and a counselor sitting together in the dawn, holding the weight of shared grief and discovering that grief borne together is somehow lighter than grief carried alone. It is understanding that death is not the end of a story, but only a transformation of it, that love does not cease when a heart stops beating, that memory is its own form of resurrection. Subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption. Thank you for watching the story of He Visits His Son's Grave every morning, not knowing someone has been leaving kind messages. Let's keep spreading the light.